guys, and welcome back. So today we're going to be doing a Wiki Wednesday Whispers. I haven't made one of these in a while, but a lot of you guys have been requesting it, and I've built up kind of a backlog of topics to talk about, so I thought, why not? So today we're going to be recording Sherlock Holmes. This one has been sitting on my backlog for a while, probably at least a year or close to it. And I've just put it off and put it off. But we're going to do it today. It looks like I've kind of peeked at it. It's got a couple of sections that sound kind of interesting. You guys know the drill. We'll read the parts that I think sound interesting, skip the parts that I don't, and we'll see where that takes us to. So, without further ado, let's get started. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional private detective created by British author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Known as a consulting detective in the stories, Holmes is known for a proficiency with observation, forensic science, and logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic, which he employs when investigating cases for a wide variety of clients, including Scotland Yard. First appearing in print in 1887 in A Study in Scarlet, the character's popularity became widespread with the first series of short stories in the Strand magazine, beginning with A Scandal in Bohemia in 1891. Additional tales appeared from then to 1927, eventually totaling 4 novels and 56 short stories. All but one are set in the Victorian or Edwardian periods, taking place between 1880 to 1914. Most are narrated by the character of Holmes' friend and biographer, Dr. Watson, who usually accompanies Holmes during his investigation and often shares quarters with him at the address of 221B Baker Street, London, where many of the stories begin. Though not the first fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes is arguably the most well-known, with Guinness World Records listing him as the most portrayed movie character in history. I had no idea. Holmes' popularity and fame are such that many have believed him to be not a fictional character, but a real individual. Numerous literary and fan societies have been founded that pretend to operate on this principle. Widely considered a British cultural icon, the character and stories have had a profound and lasting effect on mystery writing and popular culture as a whole, with both the original tales as well as thousands written by authors other than Conan Doyle being adapted into stage and radio plays, television, film, video games, and other media for over 100 years. Section 2. Inspiration for the character. Edgar Allan Poe's C. Auguste Dupin is generally acknowledged as the first detective in fiction and served as the prototype for many that were created later, including Holmes. Conan Doyle once wrote, "Each of Poe's detective stories is a root from where whole literature has developed. Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it?" Conan Doyle repeatedly said that Holmes was inspired by the real-life figure of Joseph Bell, a surgeon at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, whom Doyle met in 1877 and had worked for as a clerk. Like Holmes, Bell was noted for drawing broad conclusions from minute observations. However, he later wrote to Doyle, You are yourself Sherlock Holmes, and well you know it." Sir Henry Littlejohn, chair of the medical jurisprudence at University of Edinburgh Medical School, is also cited as an inspiration for Holmes. Littlejohn, who was also police surgeon and medical officer of health in Edinburgh, provided Doyle with a link between medical investigation and the detection to be Francis Dangy Smith, a policeman and master of disguise, who went on to become Leicester's first private detective. Another might be Maximilian Heller by French author Henry Coffin. It is not known if Conan Doyle read Maximilian Heller, but in this 1871 novel, 16 years before the first adventure of Sherlock Holmes, Henry Coffin imagined a depressed, antisocial, polymath, cat-loving, and opium-smoking Paris-based detective. Part 3. Fictional Character Biography. Let's see. Family and early life. Details about Sherlock Holmes' life, except for the adventures in the books, are scarce in Conan Doyle's original stories. Nevertheless, mentions of his early life and extended family paint a loose biographical picture of the detective. An estimate of Holmes' age in his last bow places his year of birth at 1854. The story, set in August 1914, describes him as 60 years of age. His parents are not mentioned in the stories, although Holmes mentions that his ancestors were country squires in the adventure of the Greek interpreter. He claims that his grandmother was sister to the French artist Vernet, without further clarifying whether this was Claude Joseph Collet or Horace Vernet. Holmes' brother Mycroft, 7 years his senior, is a government official who appears in The Adventure of the Greek Interpreter, The Final Problem, and The Adventure of the Bruce Barrington Plans, and is mentioned in The Adventure of the Empty House. Mycroft has a unique civil service position as a kind of human database for all aspects of government policy. He lacks Sherlock's interest in physical investigation, however, preferring to spend his time at the Diogenes Club. Holmes says that he first developed his methods of deduction as an undergraduate. His earliest cases, which he pursued as an amateur, came from fellow university students. A meeting with a classmate's father led him to adopt detection as a profession, and he spent 6 years after university as a consultant before financial difficulties led him to accept John H. Watson as a fellow lodger in 1881, where the first published story, A Study in Scarlet, begins. The two take lodgings at 221B Baker Street, London, an apartment at the upper end of the street, up 17 steps. Life with Watson. Holmes worked as a detective for 23 years with physician John Watson, assisting him for 17. They were roommates before Watson's 1887 marriage and again after his wife's death. The residence is maintained by their landlady, Mrs. Hudson. Most of the stories are frame narratives, written from Watson's point of view as summaries of the detective's most interesting cases. Holmes frequently calls Watson's writing sensational and populist, suggesting that it fails to accurately and objectively report the science of his craft. Nevertheless, Holmes' friendship with Watson is his most significant relationship. When Watson is injured by a bullet, although the wound turns out to be quite superficial, Watson is moved by Holmes' reaction. The Great Hiatus. The first set of Holmes stories was published between 1887 and 1893. Wishing to devote more time to his historical novels, Conan Doyle killed off Holmes in a final battle with the criminal mastermind, Professor James Moriarty, in The Final Problem, published in 1893 but set in 1891. After resisting public pressure for 8 years, the author wrote The Hound of Bakersfield, serialized in 1901 through 1902, with an implicit setting before Holmes' death. In 1903, Conan Doyle wrote The Adventure of the Empty House. Set in 1894, Holmes reappears, explaining to a stunned Watson that he had faked his death in the final problem to fool his enemies. The Adventure of the Empty House marks the beginning of the second set of stories, which Conan Doyle wrote until 1927. Holmes aficionados refer to the period from 1891 to 1894 between his disappearance and presumed death in the final problem and his reappearance in The Adventure of the Empty House as the Great Hiatus. Though 1908's The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge is described as taking place in 1892 due to an error on Conan Doyle's part. The earliest known use of this expression is in the article Sherlock Holmes and the Great Hiatus by Edgar W. Smith, published in July 1946, issue of the Baker Street Journal. Retirement. In his last bow, Holmes has retired to a small farm on the Sussex Downs and taken up beekeeping as his primary occupation. The move is not dated precisely, but can be presumed to predate 1904, since it is referred to retrospectively in the second stain, first published that year. The story features Holmes and Watson coming out of retirement to aid the war effort. Only one other adventure, The Adventure of the Lion's Mane, narrated by Holmes, takes place during the detective's retirement. Personality and habits. Watson describes Holmes as a bohemian in his habits and lifestyle, described by Watson in The Hound of Bakersfield as having a cat-like love of personal cleanliness. Holmes is an eccentric, with no regard for contemporary standards of tidiness or good order. In The Adventure of Musgrave Ritual, Watson says, although in his methods of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very center of his wooden mantelpiece. He had a horror of destroying documents. Thus, months after month, his paper accumulated until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscript, which were on no account to be burned, and which could not be put away save by their owner. In many of the stories, Holmes dives into an apparent mess to find an item most relevant to a mystery. The detective starves himself at times of intense intellectual activity, such as during the adventure of the Norwood builder, wherein, according to Watson, Holmes had no breakfast for himself, for it was one of his peculiarities that in his more intense moments he would permit himself no food, and I would have known him to presume upon his iron strength until he fainted from pure inanition. Although his chronicler does not consider Holmes' habitual use of a pipe a vice per se, Watson, a physician, occasionally criticizes the detective for creating a poisonous atmosphere of tobacco smoke. Holmes acknowledges Watson's disapproval in The Adventures of the Devil's Foot. I think, Watson, I shall resume that course of tobacco poisoning which you have so often and so justly condemned. His companion condones the detective's willingness to pen the truth on behalf of a client, lying to the police, concealing evidence, or breaking into houses when he feels it is morally justifiable, but condemns Holmes' manipulation of innocent people in The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. Holmes derives pleasure from baffling police inspectors with his deductions and his supreme confidence, bordering on arrogance, in his intellectual abilities. While the detective does not actively seek fame and is usually content to let the police take public credit for his work, Holmes is pleased when his skills are recognized and responds to flattery. Police outside London ask Holmes for assistance if he is nearby, even during a vacation. Watson's stories in newspaper articles reveal Holmes' role in the cases, and he becomes well known as a detective. Many clients ask for his help instead of or in addition to that of the police. Government officials and royalty are among those he serves. A prime minister and the King of Bohemia visit 221B Baker Street to request Holmes' assistance. The government of France awards him its Legion of Honor for solving a case. Holmes declines a knighthood for services which may perhaps someday be described. The King of Scandinavia as a client, and he aids the Vatican at least twice. The detective acts on behalf of the British government in matters of national security several times. As shooting practice during a period of boredom, Holmes decorates the wall of his Baker Street lodging with a patriotic VR in bullet pockets from his revolver. Although the detective is usually dispassionate and cold during an investigation, he is animated and excitable. He has a flair for showmanship, preparing elaborate traps to capture and expose a culprit, often to impress observers. Except for that of Watson, Holmes avoids casual company. When Watson proposes visiting a friend's home for rest, Holmes only agrees after learning that the establishment was a bachelor one, and that he would be allowed the fullest freedom. In The Adventure of Gloria Scott, he tells the doctor that during 2 years at college, he made only one friend, Victor Trevor. I was never a very social fellow, Watson, always rather fond of moping in my rooms and working out of my own little methods of thought, so that I never mixed much with the men of my year. My line of study was quite distinct from that of my other fellows, so that we had no points of contact at all. The detective is similarly described by Stamford in A Study in Scarlet. Holmes relaxes with music in the Red-Headed League, taking the evening off from a gaze to listen to Pablo de Sarasta play violin. His enjoyment of vocal music, particularly Wagner's, is evident in The Adventure of the Red Circle. Drug use. Holmes occasionally uses addictive drugs, especially in the absence of stimulating cases. He uses cocaine, which he injects in a 7% solution with a syringe to keep him kept in a Morocco leather case. Although Holmes also dabbles in morphine, he expresses strong disapproval when he visits an opium den. Both drugs were legal in the late 19th century England. Watson and Holmes use tobacco, smoking cigarettes, cigars, and pipes, and the detective is an expert at identifying tobacco ash residue. As a physician, Watson strongly disapproves of his friend's cocaine habit, describing it as the detective's only vice, and concerned about its effects on Holmes' mental health and intellect. In The Adventures of the Missing Three-Quarter, Watson says that although he has weaned Holmes from drugs, he remains an addict whose habit is not dead, but merely sleeping. Finances. During his career, Holmes worked for the most powerful monarchs and governments of Europe, including his own. Wealthy aristocrats and industrialists and impoverished pawnbrokers and governesses. Although, when the story begins, Holmes initially needed Watson to share the rent for their residence at 221B Baker Street, by the time of the final problem, he says that his services to the government of France and the Royal House of Scandinavia had left him with enough money to retire comfortably. The detective is is known to charge clients for his expenses and claim any reward offered for a problem solution. In The Adventure of the Speckled Band, he says that Helen Stoner may pay any expenses he incurs and asks the bank in The Red-Headed Legion to reimburse him for money spent solving the case. Holmes, as his wealthy banker client in The Adventure of Beryl Cronin, pay the costs of recovering the stolen gems and the claims reward posted for their recovery. In The Problem of Thorbridge, the detective says, "My professional charges are upon a fixed scale. I do not vary them, save when I remit them altogether." In this context, a client is offering to double his fee, and it is implied that wealthy clients habitually pay Holmes more than his standard fee. The detective tells Watson, in a case of identity, about a gold snuff box received from the King of Bohemia after a scandal in Bohemia, and about a valuable ring given to him by the Dutch royal family in The Adventures of the Bruce Barrington plant. He receives an emerald tie pin from Queen Victoria. In The Adventure of the Priory School, Holmes rubs his hands with glee when the Duke of Hollandaise mentions his €6,000 fee. No, £6,000. The amount of which surprises even Watson at a time where annual expenses for a rising young professional were in the area of £500. However, The Adventure of Black Peter, Watson notes that Holmes would refuse to help even the wealthy and powerful if their cases did not interest him. Let's see. Attitudes towards women. As Doyle wrote to Joseph Bell, Holmes is an inhuman as a Babbage calculating machine and just about as likely to fall in love. Holmes says in The Valley of Fear, "I am not a whole-souled admirer of womankind," and in The Adventure of the Second Stain, finds the motives of women inscrutable. How can you build on such quicksand? Their most trivial actions may mean volumes. Their most extraordinary conduct may depend upon a hairpin or a curling tongs. In The Sign of the Four, he says, "I would not tell them too much. Women are never to be entirely trusted, not the best of them." Watson calls him an automaton, a calculating machine, and the detective replies, "It is one of the first importance not to allow your judgment to be biased by personal qualities. A client is to me a mere unit, a factor in a problem. The emotional qualities are antagonistic to clear reasoning. I assure you that the most winning woman I ever knew was hanged for poisoning 3 little children for their insurance money." At the end of The Sign of Four, Watson reveals to Holmes that Miss Morstan has done me the honor to accept me as a husband in perspective. Watson says in The Adventures of the Copper Beeches that the detective inevitably manifested no further interest in the client once she had ceased to be the center of one of his problems. In The Lion's Mane, Holmes writes, "Women have seldom been an attraction to me, for my brain has always governed my heart," indicating that he has been attracted to women on occasion, but has not been interested in pursuing relationships with them. Ultimately, however, in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, he claims outright that "I have never loved." Despite his overall attitude, Holmes is adept at effortlessly putting his clients at ease, and Watson says that although the detective has an aversion to women, he has a peculiarly ingratiating way with them. Watson notes in The Adventure of the Dying Detective that Mrs. Hudson is fond of Holmes because of his remarkable gentleness and courtesy in dealings with women. He disliked and distrusted the sex, but he was always a chivalrous opponent. In The Adventure of Charles Augustus Middleton, the detective easily manages to become engaged under false pretenses in order to obtain information about a case, but also abandons the woman once he has the Adler is a retired American opera singer and actress who appeared in A Scandal in Bohemia. Although this is her only appearance in the canon, she is one of the most notable female characters in the stories, the only woman who has ever challenged Holmes intellectually, and one of only a handful of people who ever bested him in a battle of wits. For this reason, Adler is the frequent subject of pastiche writing. The beginning of the story describes her, the high regard in which Holmes holds her. To Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. I have seldom heard her mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irene Adler, yet there was but one woman to him, and that woman was the late Irene Adler of dubious and questionable memory. 5 years before the story's events, Adler had a brief liaison with the Crown Prince of Bohemia, Wilhelm von Ormstein, while she was prima donna of the Imperial Opera of Warsaw. Recently engaged to the daughter of the King of Scandinavia, and fearful that if his fiancée's family learned of this impropriety, their marriage would be called off, Ormstein hires Holmes to regain a photograph of Adler and himself. Adler slips away before Holmes can succeed, leaving only a photograph of herself alone and a note to Holmes that she will not blackmail Ormstein. Her memory is kept alive by the photograph of Adler that Holmes received for his part in the case. So, I think we're going to wrap it up there today. I learned a lot of stuff about Sherlock Holmes that I didn't know. I've never actually read any of his original works. I've just seen the movies with Robert Downey Jr. and the BBC program with Benedict Cumberbatch. So I've heard a lot about Sherlock Holmes, of course, over my life growing up, but I never actually read or seen any Sherlock until I was in my teenage years. So it's interesting to learn a little bit more about the character and the backstory of Sherlock Holmes.